Anything there? Yeah, my wife is due pretty much any minute. She had some Braxton Hicks already starting up, so I might have to run if you guys see me deck out. You'll know what's going on. Father Sam asked me to come and speak tonight as a psychologist and one particularly who integrates the faith, because sometimes it can seem like these issues they're kind of glossed over. And you know, one of the benefits of being here tonight with you all is obviously you care very much about your children's faith and the spiritual life of your kids. And I actually am really, really happy to see so many men here. And it turns out that research shows that fathers who lead their family with a spiritual life have a 4 to 5 times greater influence over the outcomes for their children. And so it's really interesting. A lot of times we have that sort of cultural stereotype that praying and church and all that stuff is for the ladies, for the old women. And, you know, especially I come from an Italian background. So, you know, in Italy, if you're walking around on Sunday, you'll see all the old men out in the piazza. They're drinking their coffee and smoking their cigarettes while their wives are actually in church and doing it for them. And unfortunately, that's really devastating to family life. And it's really devastating to the mental health outcomes for our children. And so what I like to do is really bring together the world of faith and psychology so that we can see that it's really true. Like, it really matters. So who here has heard or has recognized the fact that depression, anxiety, other mental health issues are on the rise in the young kids now these days? Who has heard any solutions proposed by the schools or the media as they're telling you how bad, how dire the situation is for your kids? One person back there maybe has heard some solutions too. Okay, so maybe a couple, but it's certainly not the common experience. So we hear all the bad, we hear all the negativity, but we don't get to really be informed on or taught any of the positives or any of the things that can be done about this situation. And the crazy thing is there's actually really good research that points us in the direction of hope. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that the hope comes from an integration of understanding the ways that what we believe over here in this pocket, maybe only on Sundays sometimes, or maybe only in little bits and pieces, actually can have an effect on the rest of our lives. And so instead of having a collar and wearing all black and talking to you about how church has to be more than just a Sunday event, I'm going to come with some research and some of these issues of integration that maybe will trigger some thoughts and some interest on a different level. Who's actually interested in providing their children with the best case scenario for healthy mental health outcomes as they grow older? Okay, so we're all on the same page. And if you knew that there was a secret that nobody else is telling you about right now, you'd probably want to know what it is. And it's not to sell you some new program or to sell you some new supplement. It's actually totally free. And it's built in to our DNA. And it's built into our brains. So first of all, let's talk about the current state of adolescence and where things are at right now. I'm presenting here from some research that's been done. It's been a few years now, but there's even in the secular literature and then secular research, they're recognizing the need for a spiritual dimension to life. You know, so the pop culture, pop psychology kind of ran ahead of things, and that's when we get into all the pseudo spirituality, a lot of new age stuff. But then the Research Institute started to pay attention that people are really gravitating towards this, so maybe there's something that we can learn from it. And so there's a lot of work that's been done, even in a very secularized kind of way. But we can learn a lot from that, and that's what I do. I distill out and filter out a lot of the literature that's coming from true, authentic science so we can figure out what do the scientists tell us about our brains and integrate it with our faith. If we believe that it's true because of our faith, it should not be in any contradiction with what we find in science. And good science will point us towards the same conclusions that we believe in by faith. So what is happening here is there's some research that's been done at Columbia University. There's a book in particular called The Spiritual Child by a PhD research psychologist named Lisa Miller. And if you actually were to dig into the work of Lisa Miller, you'll find that she's pretty prejudiced against religion, which is really fascinating because as you start to go through her research, she's pretty clear about her bias. And yet, she can't deny what the data shows about children and their development and the way that we're made in our DNA, in our brain functioning, in our psychological development. It all points to the need for the transcendent, our spiritual dimension. And she kind of hobbles around trying to put together a theory where she cuts out religion but maintains spirituality. Now, we don't have to worry about that here because we can bring them both together and they fit very nicely together. But she shows that in adolescence, with a lack of spiritual growth, there's an increasing idea of a teenage flourishing having to do with polishing the outer veneer. And you can see this obviously now that these teenagers today are so focused on what they look like to their peers. And with the constant growth, technological growth of social media, there's ever new ways that weren't even around when she was publishing this to compare oneself to others. And so we see this in the childhood brain that there's actually something called infant puberty. And so for a 1 and 2 year old, there's the same kind of hormone activity in the brain that will not show up again until adolescence. So sometimes what you see in like a 1 and 2 year old is very similar to what your 14 and 15 year olds start to act like. And that's probably not a surprise, but there's actually a lot of hormonal evidence to show why that happens. Now, I know we're only up to, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. Is it second grade? Second through sixth. Okay, but does anybody have older kids than sixth grade here? So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about here is pointing to what can happen in the research from adolescence and into early adulthood, and where there's been a divorce of the spiritual life and where parents have not actually nurtured the spiritual life. It has devastating effects on young adults. And so the good news is there's still plenty of time to do something about it, and you are the people who are going to want to do something about it. And so if I can empower you and equip you with some of this data and some of this understanding, it will hopefully validate what you probably believe to be true in your heart, but you could use a little bit of social proof and a little bit of social validation. So when you see your 1 and 2 year old really interested in what they look like, how they're comparing themselves, a lot of times, especially the little girls, they have this thing called a mirror neuron system. They're starting to compare themselves. They want to look like you, or they want to act like you, or be the same. And then all of a sudden it kind of disappears in the younger ages for competition and fitting in and cliques and all those kinds of things. But then when we get back to adolescence again, it's that flood in girls of estrogen in the brain and that flood in boys of testosterone in the brain. Now everything is super focused on the superficial. And there's all sorts of ways that children are judging themselves and lining themselves up in a social hierarchy. And everything is about fitting in. Now, the thing about these kids is that they are taking cues from their parents. And so what we can do to counteract that is nurture a deeper way of understanding one's own value and goodness. Another study found that adolescence is riddled with anxiety and suffering due primarily to culture-wide parenting styles, the absentee overworking fathers, perfectionistic mothers, and very little concern with goodness or morality and verbalized family goals and time together. And these are studies done across thousands of families and lots of different children cross-culturally around the world. So there's a lot of data that's pulled here that is not particularly biased. The effect of being parented without feeling unconditional love and spiritual direction is a striving for outward success to please parents. And so when little interest is paid to the inner life of reflection or to morality or to spiritual values, that gets translated. And so what's happening is parents are communicating to their kids implicitly what matters to them. And then the kids are learning the language, the unspoken, nonverbal language of what matters. And this can be really difficult to navigate as parents because it's a lot of times what's happening between spouses or in adult conversations that kids are picking up on. And obviously, they hear everything. And they pick up on all this stuff. And so even though you might say, like, okay, this is what's really important, they're looking to read between the lines. And they're figuring out what's actually really important. And so then they're going to develop all sorts of behavioral patterns because they want your attention and they want your approval. And they don't know how to verbalize that necessarily in a healthy, mature kind of way. So then they start to just do the things that they think are going to ultimately make you happy. And so a lot of times we can, despite our best intentions and efforts, be sort of shooting ourselves in the foot and wanting to give our children this kind of nurturing development. So that's why, again, my job is to empower you with the tools because obviously we're all on the same page. This is what you want for your kids. And so if you start to think about these things a little bit differently, you'll realize that they have they're sponges, not just for the bad words that you use or the language on TV or anything else. And it's really hilarious when they drop a swear or whatever. But it's like they're looking at the dynamics, the interpersonal behavioral dynamics. And they're wondering, about what makes you really happy. And so you'll start to see that more and more. Then when we get into the older kids, I saw a couple of kids here. We still have the kids in the room. So I was gonna. Oh, back there. Hey, kids. All right, great. Good to know the audience. So, so basically, there's for girls, there's a heavy emphasis on popularity based on physical appearance and certain behaviors that are nurturing a sense of self-worth based on physical appearance. And for girls mostly, and then for boys, they find that also a lot of times getting into these risk-taking behaviors, drug use, those kinds of things, and how they sort of build a sense of popularity and hierarchy and understanding sort of where they fit in society. Really interesting, if you go back to the infantile puberty period as well, they did these studies that showed that a 2-year-old boy already has an understanding of the hierarchy, the social hierarchy, and they know where they fit in the hierarchy, and that those self-qualifications or self-judgments hold true to even when they're 15, and in research done later when they do a post-test kind of data research on that. So we're built to know, recognize, look for, and also to test where we fit in the social fabric. And so for little boys, this is why they're always daredevils and they're always attempting all these crazy things. And then in adolescence, obviously, that's what gets them into a lot of trouble. But this is what's happening here. They're trying to find a place in the world. And so then ultimately, all of this comes together in a really negative way for adolescents, where there's a need to test limits and experiment with drugs and alcohol. And so there was a psychologist by the name of William James. And in 1904, he already made this observation. He said, the sway of alcohol over mankind is unquestionably due to its power to stimulate the mystical faculties of human nature. Drunkenness expands, unites, and says yes. If you think about it, that's what we're called to in the spiritual life. We're called to expand, to go out of ourselves, to unite, to feel connected, and to say yes, to be open. And that's exactly what alcohol does. So you can see how there's almost a shortcut that, besides addictions theory and depression theory and trauma theory and all sorts of other things that probably play into addiction with alcohol, there's also a deep yearning in the human DNA, in our brains, to have these kinds of transcendent experiences. And so if you start to think about that's built into our kids from the youngest ages, and part of their developmental process is learning how to tap into that, make sense of that, explore that, then we can make sense of why, if they don't have the actual legitimate outlet of real spirituality and real mysticism, then they're going to find other ways to scratch that itch and nurture that need. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. In contrast, the research shows that spirituality in adolescence is associated with a 30 to 40% decrease in risk for substance abuse and depression. And there are reduced rates of depression, substance abuse, and risk-taking, especially with thrill-seeking, things like driving fast, other types of physical endangerment, and exposure to STDs. Adolescents with a personal relationship with a higher power are 70 to 80% less likely to engage in heavy substance abuse or substance use. And according to Dr. Miller at Columbia, no other preventative factor known to science and medicine has such a broad-reaching and powerful influence on the daily decisions that make or break health and wellness. Now, there are a couple of things to know here in terms of development, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about what we're talking about. Like, what's the definition here? What is spirituality? So according to Miller, she says that the idea of spirituality is an inner sense of an interactive relationship to a higher power that's loving and guiding, that precedes and transcends language, culture, and religion, that gives us a sense of direction and connection, that gives meaning and purpose, and guides us in our relationship with other people. But interestingly, and this is the thing that we don't really get enough, we don't hear this at all in the educational system. We don't hear this from our pediatrician. We don't hear this from anywhere else for this integrated understanding of faith and science. That the spiritual dimension, the spiritual faculty, is one of our many perceptual and intellectual faculties. So it's a normal part of the brain's development. So like we know what like STEM theory is and STEM education. And we know what all these different educational models say about cognitive development. And you know that there's like a certain benefit to studying, to developing your memory. And if you go really deep into the educational developmental theory, you get into the difference between perceptual reasoning and processing speed and working memory. And we understand like these are all really important faculties of the brain. But the most important faculty of the brain is the spiritual dimension. Because there is a cohesion and a unity that happens, a unifying factor of being able to be transcendent. This is part of the way we think, the way we remember, the way we feel, the way we process. And so you might not really think about this too much as adults because you've already done the hard work of figuring out how to make sense of the world. You know, how do you make sense of the problem of evil? How do you make sense of why do bad things happen to good people? And those are all very abstract, conceptual ideas. But for a little kid's brain, they're starting to try to make sense of the world. And those abstract ideas that are transcendent, that are sort of above us, are what help us to bring everything together. And so the meaning of life actually is the most important thing to really take a crack at understanding. And as parents, we have a responsibility to nurture and guide the way that our kids are starting to make sense of the world. So that's when you see these developmental things happening, where they start to ask, like, what happens when you die? Or, you know, where do these people go? Or all sorts of different dimensions. If you're teaching them the faith, you know, how do you make sense of the sacraments? Or, you know, this is not just about catechesis. It's about brain development. At least that's what I'm here to talk about. Father Sam would say it's about catechesis, but I'm here to point out the connection and to show why this is so important on a developmental level. So this has to be nurtured, just like everything else. So when you teach your kids nursery rhymes and you want them to remember and have a development of their memory, you know, if you start to do facts about science or math or anything else that you're helping them work through at home, we are doing the work of educating our children. And so we have to bring the spiritual dimension under that umbrella, under our own roofs. and show them that this is a good part of being human. And the more that you can take part in this, the deeper you're going to validate their need for that kind of experience. So we're to kind of like dig into this a little bit deeper. We can start to understand too the connection between depression and anxiety and mental health outcomes that are going very poorly right now, with a much deeper fundamental core human need. So we're all born into this world with a death anxiety. This is sort of like psychological theory that below all the addictions, below all the personality disorders, below how horrible it is to deal with Uncle Joe at the Thanksgiving table and how rude he is, or how crazy Aunt Janice is, there's all these other things that are going on at the heart of every one of us. It's deeper than the behavioral difficulties that our kids have in school or at home, and it's actually underneath any of our own secret issues that we have inside of ourselves, our own addictions, our own anger, our own irritations. And if we start to really dig into all these things, it's because of a very simple contradiction that we're all born into. And we all know that we have a survival instinct, right? We believe that from science. We've all probably felt some effect of the survival instinct. But we also see around us the reality that everybody dies. So have you ever thought about that? How does our psyche, which is pretty smart, pretty observant, pretty intuitive, recognize the fact that every single human person dies? And if I'm one of those, I happen to be human, I can anticipate the fact that I'm going to die. And yet I'm told by science that every fiber of my being, every cell in my body is somehow operating in such a way as to avoid death. That I'm made with a survival instinct. How do we exist like this? And so we at the youngest age make a compromise with reality in our psyche. We make a deal with ourselves unconsciously. And we basically come to the table and we say, okay, you want to live forever and not die, but over here, you recognize the fact that everybody dies. So let's make a deal. How about you don't have to see everything? You don't have to be so smart. Let's start to just put a little shade over that whole insight about the fact that you're going to die. Let's pretend. Let's just act like you're not going to die. How does that feel for you, survival instinct? Survival instinct's like, that sounds good to me. Now I don't have to deal with that stubborn reality. And this is the initial compromise that we make within our psyche. And then that becomes the sort of bargaining chip or the first domino that knocks over all the other dominoes. It's like, well, if you're not even recognizing the fact that people die, you certainly don't have to acknowledge the fact that you're not as great as you think you are, or that you're not always right. Now you can certainly defend a position in which you think you're right in every argument with your spouse. And that if she has a different opinion or if he has a different opinion, then they must have it wrong. It's like every other compromise with reality is nothing compared to the fact that you're ignoring the fact that you die. So if this is the fundamental basis of our psychological state that we enter into the world with. And at some point, as we're developing reason and we cross that threshold to the age of reason, and then we start to make sense of these abstract concepts like death, that's when those things become deeper and more grounded in. Well, what's the solution here? What's the real compromise? The real answer to this problem is that we don't die. In what system, in what case is that true? Obviously, in our faith. And we can now start to understand how psychologically the resurrection is the answer to our deepest needs our deepest inner psychological angst. And that the only way to make sense of this world in which we live with our psyche involved is to realize that we're actually made to live forever. And that when we're looking at death and it's causing this system malfunction, we can actually realize that we're missing part of the picture here. We're missing part of the story. And so this is how our faith can actually make sense to us, even as adults, from a different perspective. And if we start to realize, like, we're made in this way to never be satisfied with materialist reality as it is here, because we're not made for the materialist reality as it is here. We're made for the fullness of the story, where we go on and live on for eternity. And that is the deepest comfort to that psychological need for the survival instinct. So that's a big pill to swallow. Like, that's a lot to grasp just as an adult, right? I mean, that's pretty heavy stuff. But this is like what your 6-year-old is wrestling with. He or she doesn't know it. But this is what they're sort of entering into during these developmental years. Now, most of the parents in these studies are not living in a way to acknowledge these kinds of spiritual values and transcendent realities and what it is to really be human beyond the immediate material world. And so what's happening in these studies is that, or in these families that they're studying, is that their kids are opening up to these realities and looking around, and they have a proclivity naturally towards transcendent things. But when they start to ask questions or start to want to know more about it, they hit a wall. They're given the runaround. They're given the sort of, oh, well, go ask your mom about that. Or maybe we'll talk to the priest about it later. And it's almost like they're stunted. They're short-circuited. And in a lot of these cases, these things are more uncomfortable to talk about than parents who don't know how to talk to their kids about sex. And it's like, some parents would rather talk to their kids about that than about the spiritual life or about God or about death or any of these kinds of transcendent things. And so the natural urge that's developing in these children, all children, that they want to know about these things are not being validated. And then they turn inwards. And that's when we see that there's this direction where kids can go in. Instead, where it's like, well, what does mom and dad really do? What do they care about? And, mom's on her phone all day and dad's, only at work, and, they're upset about certain things. So those are the things that matter. And this is what's talked about the most. So that's what we want to emphasize. And that's what we need to grow into. And so all of a sudden they're realizing, like, okay, yeah, my desire for the transcendent was actually not right in some way. It's like Santa Claus. So, but this is what actually really matters. Let's go in that direction. But then that inner contradiction is not overcome. And there's no real answer to the survival instinct built into the psyche. And the more that transcendent is denied, the more depression, the more anxiety, the more behavioral issues, the more other things start to set in. Does that connection make sense? Is that seeming like it connects there? So this is why this is not just like a current contemporary issue. I mean, obviously we have COVID and we have all this stuff that's crazy now, and obviously there are things happening right now, but this has been an age-old problem. The answer has always come from the fact that we used to live in a Christian society, that it was much more approachable and it was much more common to talk about things like prayer and the spiritual life. And it was more normal to see priests and religious and nuns in habits and to talk about these things of God. And in our culture and society, that's disappearing very quickly. And I've got, neighbors that tell our kids that Christmas is a fantasy and it's a nice, beautiful story. It's a fairy tale. And, we're surrounded by policies and school issues and all sorts of stuff that are happening right now, which have completely ripped out the rug from underneath an objective moral fabric that would point to a transcendent source of what is right and what is wrong. Right? So this is what's at stake. It's not just current political policy that's at stake. It's actually deforming our children. So what's the real hope here? What's the real beauty of all this? Is that we're actually ultimately in charge of our own families and our own children, right? So it doesn't actually matter what's happening in the world around us ultimately to affect our children if we hold the authority that is implicit in our DNA. It's not just that God gave us the authority to be the leaders of our family and as parents, that we are the formators of our children's education. That is church teaching, and it is our faith, but it's more than just morality and faith. It's actually built into our DNA. And so your children will look at you biologically. Their brains are tuned in to you. Whatever the state says, whatever educational allowances are made for taxes and for vouchers and all these other things, it doesn't matter. It will never change your kids' brains from being completely oriented to studying you and what you do and how you do it. So this is the hope, is that nobody can take your power away and authority of actually being able to form your children. Now, the difficult part is that you can give up your power and authority. And so this is where a lot of the things that I do in talking is to empower parents with knowledge and validation to recognize the fact that you're on the right track to want to nurture your kids' spirituality. And you can't do it enough. You have to go further and deeper. And here's the issue. Most of the time when I dig into this with parents, and we have a practice, we have 18 therapists, we see families all over the world. We work with kids, with marriages, with adults, and we get a lot of referrals for parents that want us to help with their kids. And at this point, it's on our first page of our questionnaire for the kids is to the parents, are you willing to work on yourself? Because it's never just the kid's problem. And I don't care if your kid's burning down houses or dropping out of school or whatever it is. There's always some part that we are all playing in all these issues. And by the way, I put myself first in that line. We're all screwing up our kids. So let's just be okay with that. And thank God we have a God who knows that that's going to be the case, which is why we all need a Savior. But if we recognize that, then we can see, okay, what can I do to correct course here? And it's this one very simple principle. You can't give what you don't have. So number one, recognize that there's a very deep need in your children developmentally to understand spirituality, a transcendent view of the world. It's a developmental necessity of their brains and their heart, their spirit. And it's to answer that deepest fear of death. And there's no way to answer the fear of death without either A, the truth that we don't die, or B, completely distorting reality. And then number three, you can't give what you don't have. So essentially, you have to have the peace to know that it's okay that death happens in this world. Which means it's a call to nurture your own spirituality. And if you don't do it for yourself, if you never really found the time or the importance or the whatever it was that was missing, maybe you didn't have parents that instilled it in you, or maybe you saw ugly versions of it. That happens more often than we'd like to admit. It doesn't mean that the whole thing is wrong, and we're still built to need it. So this is the call, this is the invitation to embrace that responsibility and that authority that you have, but to lead first. And by thinking through and really understanding, like, okay, where can I grow in the spiritual life so that I have a deeper sense of the goodness of the world and the okayness of eternity, that everything is going to be okay. And if I can live with that peace in such a way that it's not just a nice idea on Sunday, but it actually permeates the way that I think and I feel and I interact with my spouse and the way that I talk about the neighborhood and the community and interact with the in-laws who drive us crazy and everything else in between, that's what is going to actually help our kids make sense of this world in the same way. And so this is what, I do have the book, The Mindful Catholic, which you all got a free copy of last time you all met, and I did bring a couple extras there too. But this is the point of that book, is it connects the dots between a psychological practice, and there's something called mindfulness. You've probably all heard of mindfulness, but there's actually a psychological protocol. It's not just a fancy app or a new fad on Netflix, but it's actually something that has been studied for 40 years and has shown to have, as a psychological protocol, tremendous effect in decreasing anxiety and depression and increasing flourishing in many different ways. And it was originally developed as a way to understand the way our brains work and how we all operate out of that fight or flight response, which is connected to our survival instinct. But the way that it was originally proposed, it didn't have a connection to that spiritual reality that goes beyond this world in a Christian way. It actually had a connection to a Buddhist worldview. And in the Buddhist worldview, you don't have to be afraid of death because you're not real, essentially. And not to make light, I say that with reverence, but that's the Buddhist perspective, is that the self is an illusion. And so actually there's no reason to fear death. And so then you can employ these psychological practices to reduce your anxiety and depression and fear. Well, we would not agree with the whole system there. And we would say, though, we have a different reason to not be afraid of death. And that's because we have a Father who loves us, who created us in his image to be with him for eternity. And that everything that we taste here and touch here, everything here is just a foretaste. So if you think that the luxuries of your life are great, and if you think that all your hopes and dreams are great, and I actually it's actually sad. I don't think we hope and dream enough. I think we lost the capacity for real dreaming when we were young. But think about the dreams that you had as a kid. Think about what you thought about marital life before you got married. Think about the even just the thoughts about the pleasure, the physical pleasures and joys of life. That's nothing compared to what we're created for. And so the finitude, the limitations that we hit in this world are an indication that we're actually made for more, and that we're going to be satisfied beyond our greatest desires or imagination when we enter into that fullness of reality for eternity. So that's the foundation, and that's the whole fabric of justification for why we should be at peace right now, and why we can allow for suffering and embrace difficulties in our life and find the charitable way to interact with the people in our life. And that's how we can set those examples for our kids. But so I took that 8-week protocol, and then I basically integrated it with a Catholic spirituality called abandonment to divine providence, or trustful surrender. It has a couple different names. And it basically just says that in every present moment, we can connect with God in such a way that your worries about what's going to happen tomorrow, your worries about the things you didn't get done today, your worries about things that happened before, bad conversations, conflicts, things that might not go your way in the future, all those things are being created in your brain because of your survival instinct. But in this moment, if you're actually physically safe, then by paying attention to this moment, you're going to give your brain the best chance it has at being its best version of itself. And this is actually what Jesus told us. This is what he challenged us to. He said, do not be anxious about the things of your life. Who here has heard him say that before? Has anybody heard that scripture before? Do not be anxious about the things of your life. Who has heard Jesus say, take this and eat it, this is my body? Anybody heard that before? Okay, in the gospel, when he said that this is truly my body, this is the bread of life, and he lost disciples that day because people thought he was crazy. He's like, this is true food. You can eat this, my body. and he lost disciples. They thought he was crazy for saying that. Now, how many people think that you can live your life? Oh, first of all, how many people believe him? How many people believe that it's really, truly his body and really, truly his blood? How many people here believe in the Eucharist? Okay. So also Jesus said, do not be anxious about the things of your life. Do not have any anxiety in your life. Nobody has heard him say that before? Father Sam heard him say that before. Did you skip that gospel? He says it. He says, do not be anxious about the things of your life. How many people believe that that's possible? It sounds a little crazy. So the same guy who says you can eat this is my flesh, we believe that. But do we really believe that we can live a life without anxiety? That we can live a life without depression? That we can live a life without these worries? Now, biological illness aside, because there's lots of ways that actual biological illness causes some of these things. But on a very general level, we are called to live without worry. And that's what can open up our brains in ways that we can live with true joy. And we can live with creativity. And we can live with humor. And we can have fun. And this is the witness that we could be in this world that we're created to be. There's a reason for our joy. It's because we have a God who has conquered death. That can't just be relevant on Sunday only. That has to change the way we live our entire life. That is what will form our children and give them their best chance at having good mental health outcomes when they turn 18, 19, 20. So this is what we need to look for. So in the book, in the Mindful Catholic, I just go through very simply what you can do with your brain, because it sounds like really nice as an abstract thought. It's like spiritual. It's like, oh yeah, that sounds great. But then you get back into your car and you're like, I didn't realize how late it was. And now you're like off to the races and worrying about work and all these other things. So what do you actually do with your brain to be different? And if you have a justification for why you can be different and how you can be different, then you can employ a practice of how to be different. That's what the Mindful Catholic is all about. So I encourage you to, and again, it was free, so I'm not trying to sell you anything. You already have it. But it will gain for you an opportunity to learn how to have even deeper peace in your life and be able to give that to your kids by connecting the dots between their spiritual lives and their psychological well-being. All right, thank you. Let's start off with end with some question and answer time here. I have a lot more data here and other things like that get into sort of the darkness of how bad it can get and the statistics and all that kind of thing. So we can talk about that if you want to, but I've also, we could talk about developmental phases or where your kids actually are at, or different ways that they maybe express some of those needs or how to answer certain questions. So all the typical ways that usually parents need some guidance in these areas.
I got a question over here.
Sure.
Do you keep having all these kids so you can study them?
We have a lot of kids. I love my wife to start, so that's a good place to start. And they're so joyful. Yeah, no, I know. We took a road trip. I did a talk. I was with a group of parents last week, and I wasn't even really planning on talking about it, but we had our 10-year anniversary. And then so I just went with my wife for a couple of days, and we got back. We're like, we got to do something just with the kids. So let's just pile in the car and let's just drive somewhere. So we just drove out to Pittsburgh. We took 4 days and just crashed at a hotel. It was like, it was awesome. We loaded up the car. We had snacks and movies and all this stuff with headphones. And then they looked like they were silent. I got like the most blank stares back. And then finally one guy just raises his hand. He goes, "You did that on purpose?" I was like, oh boy, I better. Go ahead.
Do you see a big difference in the past? I don't know how long you've been practicing, but let's say 10 years or so. Do you see some of this, are the struggles similar or are they exacerbated today? Do you see any difference?
With other parents in our own family?
No, just like kids, just in your, like coming to you who need help. Are the issues they have similar as they were, let's say, 10, 15 years ago?
I think there's a common theme. I mean, when I remember like 10 years ago, I was here. I might have been here actually. And I was here specifically to talk on screen time. And that was like everybody's concern. And then last week, I was talking about developmental stages and sort of needs for discipline and having, talks about sex and things like that. And then inevitably the conversation just went in the direction of screen time again. And it's like what everybody wants to talk about. It's like how much. So I think that, and to share from our own personal life, the needs of the younger kids definitely transform. Now our kids are a little bit older, and the effect of the other neighborhood kids and things like screen time is a striking difference. And so I think it just requires more authority, more taking responsibility for the role that we can play. But that's one thing that I see is actually really similar. The other superficial issues, I'd say superficial, they're becoming more prominent sort of in the media and everything else, dealing with everything from like, gender and mixed families and all those kinds of other issues. Obviously, there's been a real progression in those kinds of things coming up, but I think still at the heart of the issue there's still some of the more common themes.
I listen to your podcast a lot, and you touched base on that whole thing with the gender identity and how you meet your kids with that.
Yeah.
And spirituality. Are you going to touch base on any of that tonight at all?
Sure, I certainly can. Yeah,
it was really good topic that you brought up and had a lot of information on it.
Thank you. Yeah, I do. I have a podcast called the Being Human podcast, and so we open up all sorts of different issues related to faith and psychology. And the particular issue that you're asking about when it comes to the gender issues and what I call gender confusion, I think my position and my responsibility that I have is to show the truth and the goodness and beauty of a Catholic position from a place that's really grounded and foundational and a proposal to something beautiful. So, a lot of times we get sort of into the fight and then we're sort of dug in and we're not really seeing the bigger picture. And I think for all history, no matter what the issue of the day has been, there's a way to point towards the transcendent, truth and goodness and beauty, and to say, like, if this is actually how we believe God made us, and this is actually what we believe God made us for, then that's got to resonate on the human level with people. And so if we can get away from like the anger and the fighting and the just the argument part of it, and we can say like, what are people actually looking for? And actually that's what I also look for. And this is a really good principle for kids, or the opposite political perspective would depend regardless of which side you're on. Try to understand where they're coming from. One of my favorite psychologists and theorists and influencers of the 20th century is Mr. Rogers. Fred Rogers, he's one of my absolute favorites because he could see the goodness of a child and he wanted to understand what motivated a child, what did a child care about, what made a child tick inside. And instead of where culture was at now, really disregarding children and be like, stay quiet and stay out of view, he saw them as the marginalized of society. And he wanted to really enter in and validate their experience. Now, it doesn't mean that children do everything correctly, but his position was one of love. And so he entered in to really understand the experience. And I'd say that's a really good disposition to have with our own kids, with our spouses, and also with people with very different perspectives. So, for instance, one thing that I look at is like when people have these ideas about gender or what's right and wrong and all these things, it's like, well, let me think about where they're coming from and why they might be right in their perspective. So, and I'm not saying be relativistic and sort of, go for anything. But if they're human, they're probably in touch with some truth. And if I put myself in a mindset that says, well, how might they be right about this first? Then I could try to enter in with a position that's more engaging, and we can actually have a real conversation. Because instead, the way we talk about it now is like, because it's all the social media stuff and all the screen stuff, I just see a screen, and I can easily demonize an opinion or a perspective or position and forget that it's a human being that actually is voicing that particular perspective. So that's the way I approach it. And then all of a sudden, you start to have insights into things that maybe we wouldn't have seen before. And I've had lots of insights talking to people from very different perspectives because of why they think what they think. And I maybe at the end of the day don't agree with their conclusions any more than when I started, but I can definitely have new insights about why they might think that way. And if you have anything more specific, I'm happy to dig into it, or anybody else about these issues. I always tell people I'm out there with my opinions. I'm a licensed psychologist. I don't know if I'll have a license for very much longer, but as long as I'm putting it all out there. So this is a safe place. You look like you have another question.
It's a lot of it based on what I've heard on your podcast. And some of it's just in general, like you have kids that are growing up, right? And they're going to be suffering. They'll get bullied in school. They go through stuff. So how do we as parents, using the things that you're sharing with us to meet them and kind of guide them in that spiritual path so that they can, one, identify their suffering, two, come at peace, and then from there, kind of steer them in the right direction.
Yeah, no, it's really good, practically speaking, and it seems like a hard answer or maybe a non-answer, but it's really, number one, you can't give what you don't have, and you really got to drink it in. You really got to really believe it, that it's all going to be okay. And the ironic thing is, when it comes to kids, our kids are the number one challenge to us believing like it's going to be okay. Like it's the thing most of the time we care most about in this world. So it's the one thing that really pushes us to really believe that it's going to be okay, regardless of what's happening to them, regardless of what they're thinking. And as the kids get older, I didn't get into it, but the developmental phases in adolescence and later adolescence, there's a necessary stage of individuation that they have to break apart from the faith and formation of their family of origin. And so the peace in which you let them go communicates to them the truth of what you really believe. If you think about that, it's like you put your belief into action by being at peace with them not doing everything just because you told them to. And it's like saying, believe in God. He says it's all going to be okay. All will be well. We'll believe in God. Well, I don't feel like I'm going to go to church. No, it's not going to be okay. You have to go to church, so you don't know what's going to happen. And it's like, Dad, do you really believe that everything is going to be okay no matter what happens? So it's like that, in that moment, in that tension, we have the opportunity to really put it into practice. So that's number one. And then number two is to really enter into their experience and really spend time understanding, empathizing. So if you're a dad especially, and this goes for moms too, but if you're a dad who's living the faith, walking the walk, and then spending time really caring about and entering into their world, that combination is the strongest thing that you can give them for the rest of their life. And even if they go far afield, chances are, statistics show that they're coming back. And it might take 5 years, it might take 10 years. It might take a lot of bumpiness along the way in the road. But that's the thing that's going to be that inner compass that magnetizes them and gravitates them back towards that center. Other thoughts? Any questions? All right, well, do grab a book if you missed the free one. The Sitting Like a Saint, we sell them. I'll sell them for $10. It's just a contribution to our nonprofit foundation, and we provide resources, supplements to people who are suffering. They can't afford the help. So we have a little scholarship set up for people that are looking for help. So if anybody wants to donate to that, obviously we won't say no. Otherwise, you can get in touch with me through Father Sam if you have any other follow-up questions. And I appreciate all of your time and attention. God bless you.